I was standing in the middle of the theater when the room went quiet. The applause had stopped, the lights dimmed, and the final credits began to roll across the screen. There it was, my name, Eleanor Reeves, memory consultant, uncredited. For a moment, I didn't even breathe. The word uncredited felt like a slap clean, public, and deliberate. I blinked, thinking maybe I'd misread it, but no. It stayed there, glowing white against the black screen, like a scar carved in light. People around me were clapping. Some stood up to cheer. Someone behind me shouted, "Brilliant work." Cameras flashed as the director hugged the producers near the front row. The sound of applause filled every corner of the hall. But for me, everything went silent. My hands were cold, my knees unsteady. I could smell the burnt sweetness of popcorn mixed with the heavy perfume of the woman sitting beside me. The projector light washed over the crowd and caught on the rim of my glasses. It felt like being examined under a spotlight I hadn't agreed to stand in. The film on that screen, the one now winning awards, was about women reclaiming their erased memories. Except the one woman who had started it, built it, and lived it had just been erased. A colleague leaned close to me and whispered, trying to be kind, "Aren't you happy, Eleanor? The film just won." I turned toward him and smiled, or at least tried to. My lips moved, but I couldn't hear my own voice. I felt like I was smiling from the bottom of a grave. I thought about the hundreds of hours I'd spent interviewing survivors, digitizing old photographs, funding the shoots when money ran out. I'd written the grant proposals. I'd built the framework. Every story in that film had passed through my hands first. And yet, as the crowd stood to give a standing ovation, I was the only person sitting, unseen. The director walked on stage to accept the award. His voice echoed through the hall. "This film is for every woman who's ever been silenced, every voice that history forgot." Everyone clapped louder. I almost laughed. The irony was too sharp to swallow. In that instant, I realized something I had never understood before. Being betrayed in the light hurts more than being forgotten in the dark. 10 years ago, before anyone called me a memory consultant, I was just a freelance photographer trying to pay the bills. Weddings, funerals, lost and found portraits. Anything that could fit in the viewfinder and earn me enough for rent. I used to joke that I photographed people either at their happiest or their most heartbroken. And sometimes, those two moments looked almost the same through a lens. When my husband fell ill in the late 80s, I sold nearly half of what we owned to keep us afloat. The only thing I refused to sell was my Polaroid camera, a clunky silver model from 1984 that I'd bought with half a month's food budget. It wasn't just equipment, it was a witness. That camera had seen me through hospital corridors, weddings in cheap banquet halls, and nights when I developed prints in the bathroom because it was the only place with a lock. After he died, I stopped taking client jobs for a while. Then one afternoon, a widow came to me with a shoebox of torn photographs. She wanted to know if I could fix them. Not for money, she said, but so she could remember her family without the holes. We sat at my kitchen table, piecing together what time had chewed apart. Yet I thought, maybe photographs aren't just for keeping faces, maybe they're for keeping courage. A year later, I opened a small studio on the corner of 9th and Elm. I called it Reframe Studio. It wasn't fancy peeling paint, secondhand lights, but women began to show up. Some brought damaged prints, others brought stories they had never told out loud. We would scan their photos, repair the tears, then talk about what couldn't be repaired. Somewhere between pixels and silence, healing started to happen. I told my students the same thing at the start of every class. Memory doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest. Hearing that, sometimes, I think I needed to hear it more than they did. The old Polaroid hung on the wall like a relic. I never used it anymore. The flash was broken, and film had become too expensive. Still, I kept it there, pointed toward the room, as if it were watching us reclaim what the world had tried to crop out. In 2000, filmmaker named Mason came by. He said he'd seen an online post about my classes and wanted to make a documentary about women reclaiming lost memories through photography. At first I laughed. I'd turned down plenty of reporters before. Most of them wanted quick stories about grief that could fit into 3 minutes of airtime. But Mason seemed different. He was polite, curious, and he listened. He said, "People need to see this, Eleanor. They need to see how these women rebuild their pasts." When he asked if I could help produce the film, I agreed, but only on one condition. The women had to keep their real names, and nothing could be cut or altered without their consent. I remember writing that clause by hand at the bottom of the agreement, underlining it twice. He smiled and said, "Of course, Alt. This is about truth." I believed him. For the next 2 years, my studio turned into a small film set. The women didn't mind, they liked being seen. The cameras captured laughter, trembling hands, and the quiet moments when someone finally recognized herself in an old picture. Mason filmed everything, sometimes too much. But I told myself that transparency was good. I didn't realize then how easy it is for truth to disappear once it passes through someone else's lens. When the editing started, he stopped visiting as often. His emails got shorter. He said they were streamlining the story to make it more cinematic. I didn't think much of it at first. Every documentary needs structure, I told myself. But one evening, when I dropped by the studio to return some photos, I saw a rough cut playing on his monitor. The credits rolled quickly, and my name wasn't there. When I asked, he said it was just a temporary file, that they were still adjusting placements. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe him. Now, looking back, I can see the signs clearly. The new assistants who avoided eye contact, the project meetings I was too busy to be invited to, the change in tone when he called me ma'am instead of Eleanor. Each detail was small, almost invisible, like dust on a lens, but together they blurred everything that mattered. That old Polaroid still hangs in my house today. The plastic is yellowed, the strap cracked, but whenever I pass it, I remember why I started all of this, to help women hold on to the truth of who they are. I never thought I'd be the one fighting to hold on to mine. So when the film finally premiered and I saw that word, uncredited, it wasn't just a label. It was a verdict. It said, "We took your light, but we'll keep your name in the shadows." And maybe that's why it hurts so much. Because the very project that promised to give women their stories back had quietly stolen mine. I still remember a winter morning in 1989, the kind that froze breath in midair before it could turn into words. I'd been hired to photograph a young couple who could barely afford the session. They'd saved for months just to have a few pictures taken before the husband left for a construction job in another state. We met in an abandoned greenhouse on the edge of town because it was free and had enough light. The windows were clouded with frost. Every exhale fogged the lens. I kept apologizing for the cold, but the woman only smiled, tucking her hands into the sleeves of her worn coat. When I lifted the camera, she hesitated. "Could you not photograph my face?" she asked softly. "Just my hands." I lowered the camera, confused. "Your hands?" She nodded. "I want to remember that once they held someone. Faces change, but hands, they tell the truth." There was something in her voice that made me stop adjusting the focus. I simply watched as she reached for her husband's fingers. They were rough, chapped, trembling a little from the cold. For a few seconds they didn't move, just breathed together in the white light filtering through the glass. I pressed the shutter. Click. The instant the picture slid out, she exhaled, a sound half relief, half grief. The photograph showed two hands, one small and curved like a question mark, the other broad and steady beneath it. No smiles, no eyes, just touch. At that moment, I understood what photography really was. It wasn't about beauty or composition. It was proof that something, someone, had existed. Years later, that same Polaroid hung in my first exhibit, The Hands We Held. Critics called it a portrait of invisible love. For me, it was simply the first time I'd listened instead of directed. I didn't know then how much that image would follow me. When I started Reframe Studio, I kept a copy of the photo pinned to the wall above my desk. Whenever a student doubted her own worth or said she had nothing left to offer, I'd point to it and say, "Those hands belong to people who thought they had nothing left either." It became a quiet emblem of the work we were doing, restoring what life had rubbed away. 30 years later, when Mason slid the contract across the table for the documentary project, I caught myself looking down at my own hands. They had changed. Veins sharper, skin thinner, but they still trembled in the same way. I remembered that winter morning in the greenhouse, how the woman's fingers had clung to what she loved. I should have recognized the feeling then. The small tremor that comes before letting something precious go. But I told myself it was excitement. I signed. The pen left a small blot of ink where my hand shook. I didn't realize I had just photographed my own mistake. Because 3 decades after I captured those joined hands, it would be mine that trembled, signing away the story I had spent my whole life trying to protect. From the very first production meetings, I began to notice something small, but sharp enough to leave a mark. Mason, the young director, had a habit of interrupting me. At first, I told myself it was enthusiasm. He was 30-something, ambitious, eager to make something meaningful. But after the 3rd or 4th time he cut across my sentence, I realized he wasn't listening. He was waiting for his turn to talk. During one meeting, as we reviewed early footage, I tried to explain why some of the women preferred to appear in shadows rather than full light. He stopped me mid-sentence. "Eleanor, audiences don't want to see pain," he said. "They want inspiration from you, not about you." He smiled as if he were offering a compliment. I laughed, thinking he was joking. "I didn't know pain and inspiration were 2 different things," I said. He didn't answer. He was already typing something into his laptop. I brushed it off. I'd worked with difficult men before, gallery owners, editors, critics. They all had a way of making your story sound better once your name was smaller. Still, a part of me felt the faint, familiar chill of being politely erased. Weeks passed. Each time I visited the editing room, my image on the screen seemed to fade a little more. At first, I thought it was a technical issue. The lighting too dim, the color grading still unfinished. But then I noticed the pattern. My interviews were shorter, my voice often replaced by narration. Once, I asked the assistant editor about it. She avoided my eyes and said softly, "They're just trying to keep the runtime tight." I wanted to believe her. I really did. On the far wall of the editing suite hung a Polaroid I'd taken years ago, one Mason insisted we frame for inspiration. It was a portrait of me, half smiling, half caught in motion, with a faint crack running down the film. The split ran straight through my left eye, like a lightning bolt frozen in time. Every time I came in, the photo seemed to stare back differently. Some days, the crack looked like a scar. Other days, a warning. One afternoon, while Mason was adjusting the sound levels, I asked lightly, "Do you ever feel like the camera has opinions of its own?" He chuckled. "Only when it points at the wrong subject." It was meant as humor, but it lodged somewhere deep. I remember sitting there, pretending to focus on the footage, while inside I felt the first thread of doubt tighten. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was the wrong subject. After that, I started keeping my own small archive copies of scripts, shot lists, drafts of emails, just in case something went missing. I'd learned long ago that erasure doesn't happen all at once. It starts quietly, like dust settling until it blurs the image. The day we finished the rough cut, Mason invited the crew for a toast. Everyone clapped, glasses clinked, and someone turned up the music. I slipped out early. As I left, I passed the Polaroid again. Under the fluorescent light, the crack across my face caught a faint silver sheen. For a moment, it looked like the film itself was splitting apart. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at that broken image of myself, feeling a strange certainty bloom in my chest. Something in this project was about to break, and it wasn't going to be the film. The premiere night arrived faster than I expected. For weeks, Mason's team had been promoting the film interviews, glossy posters, behind-the-scenes clips. My inbox filled with invitations from people I hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to see the project that gives women their voices back. I ironed my only black dress, the same one I wore to my husband's funeral years ago. It felt strange, buttoning it up again for something that was supposed to celebrate life. The theater smelled of champagne and artificial roses. The screen stretched from wall to wall, glowing like an open wound. Mason met me at the door, his smile polished and professional. "You made it," he said, pressing a glass of wine into my hand. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. He looked at me for a second too long, then said lightly, "I hope you like the final version." We made some last-minute adjustments for pacing. Something in his tone made me uneasy, but I nodded. I'd learned that doubt is easiest to ignore when everyone around you seems so sure. The lights dimmed. The first scene appeared. One of my students, her hands trembling as she restored a photograph. My voice had narrated that moment during filming. I'd spoken about how the act of touching an old photo was like touching time itself. But now, as the words filled the room, the voice was not mine. It was smoother, higher, younger. At first, I thought it was a technical issue, a temp track left in by mistake. But the further the film went, the clearer it became. Every sentence I had spoken had been replaced. For authenticity, Mason had said earlier. Now I understood what he meant. The new voice sounded fresh and bright, the kind used in commercials selling nostalgia as comfort. The audience nodded, moved by her calm wisdom. Nobody realized that the woman who had lived those words was sitting in the dark, listening to her life translated into someone else's tone. I leaned forward, my fingers tightening around the wineglass until the stem creaked. My reflection wavered on the screen, just a faint silhouette swallowed by light. During the credits, Mason's name appeared 3 times. Director, producer, writer. Mine appeared once, at the very end, beside that single word, uncredited. When the lights came back on, Mason turned toward me, still smiling as if nothing were wrong. "It works better this way," he said quietly, almost kindly. "Audiences connect more when they hear a younger voice. Yours has. Too much history." Too much history. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Instead, I just said, "You mean too much truth." He shrugged. "It's the same thing, isn't it?" He lifted his glass. I lifted mine too, out of habit. Somewhere behind us, applause began to rise again, echoing through the hall like waves hitting concrete. I took a small sip. The wine burned down my throat. My other hand reached into my bag for the old Polaroid I always carried, the one of my face, cracked down the middle. It was supposed to remind me that imperfection is part of honesty. Tonight, it looked like a warning I hadn't heeded. Without realizing it, I gripped the photo too tightly. The paper bent, the crack deepened, and suddenly the image split in 2. The sound it made was tiny, but inside me, something enormous gave way. Mason was still talking, something about distribution deals, international festivals, but his voice had already turned into background noise. The applause, the flashlights, the chatter, it all blurred together until it sounded like static. I looked down at the 2 halves of my photograph, lying in my palm like a confession. That was the moment I understood. They hadn't erased me completely. They'd done something subtler, crueler. They had erased my age, my voice, the weight of my years, the very thing that made my story worth telling. Anya, they hadn't deleted me, they had edited me. I stood there under the same light that once made me feel seen, and for the first time, I felt invisible. That was the moment I disappeared, right inside the story I had written myself. That night, after the premiere, I couldn't sleep. I took a cab home and asked the driver to turn off the radio. The city outside was still alive. Restaurants spilling light onto the sidewalks, laughter from bars, the soft hum of celebration. But it all felt very far away, like a world I no longer belonged to. When I reached my house, I didn't turn on any lights. I just walked straight into the studio, my small square of quiet. The walls were lined with the portraits of women who had once trusted me with their stories. Smiling faces, trembling hands, blurred silhouettes that I had helped bring back to life. Every photograph seemed to breathe in the dark, like witnesses waiting for me to speak. On the work table sat the old Polaroid camera, the one from 1984. The metal was cold when I touched it, its once silver body now dulled to gray. I hadn't used it in years, but tonight it felt like the only thing that still recognized me. I turned on the projector and played the recording Mason had sent me weeks earlier, the raw footage before he'd started editing. My own voice filled the room, cracked but steady, describing what memory meant to me. We don't take photos to remember others. We take them so we can remember who we were when we looked at them. Hearing my voice again felt like touching an old scar that had just started to heal. Then I played the official version, the one with the younger voice. The words were the same, but they floated on the air like they belonged to someone who had never lost anything. They were clean, polished, and empty. I sat there for a long time, listening to the two voices overlap, mine and hers, until the sound tangled together into something unrecognizable. At some point, I whispered into the empty room. If I've been erased from the frame, do I dare project myself back into it? The question hung there, heavier than I expected. I walked over to the shelf where I kept the reels from old projects, weddings, funerals, community workshops, forgotten experiments. Each one was a piece of my past I'd been too busy to revisit. I ran my fingers across the labels, and an idea began to take shape, small at first, then impossible to ignore. What if I didn't need permission to exist in my own story? What if I could tell it myself? I wiped off the dust from the projector lens. It left a faint smear of light across my fingertips. Then I pulled out a fresh roll of film from the drawer, the kind no one used anymore. I set up the tripod, adjusted the focus, pointed the camera not at the wall, but at myself. For years, I told women to reclaim their images, to stop waiting for someone else to capture them. Now it was my turn. I pressed the shutter. The bulb flashed, soft and white, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't flinch. On the table beside me, the Polaroid began to develop slowly, the image bleeding through the blankness, first shadows, then outlines, then the faint shape of a woman looking straight at herself. I stared at that photo until the colors settled. The face was lined, the eyes tired, but it was mine, unfiltered, unedited, uncredited to anyone else. And then, quietly, I decided I would make my own film. No sponsors, no script, no one else's voice, just the truth, as crooked and imperfect as it was. I would call it Out of Frame. Not a response to Mason's film, but a continuation of what it should have been. A story of what happens when the storyteller refuses to stay invisible. I opened my notebook and began sketching ideas, scenes, names of the women I'd met through Reframe Studio. They deserved to be seen too, but this time, on their own terms. Outside, dawn was starting to seep through the blinds, that pale kind of light that doesn't promise much, just honesty. I turned off the projector, leaving the Polaroid photo on the wall beside it. The two faces, mine on film, mine in print, looked at each other through the faint beam of morning. For the first time since the premiere, I felt steady. They could keep their awards, their applause, their shiny credits. I had something they'd never understand. My story. And I was finally ready to tell it. The email arrived 2 days after I decided to make my own film. From Mason Lewis. Subject: regarding your new project. Eleanor, please don't start another film. The contract you signed gives us ownership of the original concept. I'd hate for there to be any legal complications. Polite. Short. Almost friendly, the way a warning can sound when someone wants to keep their hands clean. I read it twice, then once more, slower. Each word felt rehearsed, stripped of warmth. There was no thank you for your work, no, let's discuss this. Just a reminder that the story of my life now belonged to someone else on paper. I stared at the screen for a full minute, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Then I pressed delete. By the next morning, my production shared drive had been locked. The files I'd uploaded, draft interviews, notes, audio logs were all gone. My account access revoked for security reasons. I called one of the editors I'd worked closely with. The call went straight to voicemail. Another colleague texted back a single line, "I'm sorry, Eleanor. They told us not to get involved." And just like that, the silence began. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors or angry headlines. Just a slow retreat. The sound of doors closing one after another, until you're the only one left in the hallway. I spent the rest of that day in the studio. Outside, rain slid down the windows in thin, restless lines. Inside, everything was still. The smell of old film and dust hung in the air, the kind of smell that only exists where memories outlive people. On the table lay the Polaroid camera, next to the photograph I'd taken of myself the night I decided to fight back. The image had finished developing. A woman half in shadow, half in morning light. The frame had a small crack in the corner, like an imperfection that refused to heal. I picked it up and held it against the window. The gray sky behind it made the colors look softer, almost kind. For years I had told others to keep their evidence safe, to save their photos, their letters, their proof of existence. Why? Understood why. Evidence is the last language truth speaks when no one else will listen. My phone buzzed. Another message from Mason. Eleanor, I mean it. Don't make this personal. Let's move on gracefully. I almost laughed. Move on gracefully, the phrase people use when they want you to vanish quietly. I didn't reply. I unplugged the phone, closed my laptop, and let the studio fall back into silence. The only sound was the faint click of the old projector cooling down and the slow tick of the wall clock. I realized that this quiet was what came right before every storm in my life. The space between humiliation and defiance, between losing something and deciding you'll never lose it again. I sat down by the window, Polaroid in my hand, light spilling across the floor. No lawyers yet, no reporters, no confrontation, just me, the photo, and the light sneaking through the blinds. And for the first time since the premiere, the silence didn't frighten me. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to take mine. The invitation arrived on cream paper with gold lettering. Panel discussion, Women and Memory. A conversation with director Mason Lewis. The bottom, smaller, hosted by the New York Film Academy. For a long time I just stared at it. My first instinct was to tear it in half, but something in me said, go. Maybe it was curiosity, or anger disguised as curiosity. Either way, I needed to see how far he was willing to go. So I went. The auditorium was packed, students, critics, journalists. A banner stretched across the stage, and in the center sat Mason, smiling that practiced smile of his. Behind him, a large screen played excerpts from the film. The air was thick with admiration. People laughed at his anecdotes, scribbled notes, nodded at his every phrase. I took a seat in the back row, where no one would notice me. For a while, I watched in silence. He spoke about authenticity, representation, the delicate balance between fact and feeling. He even used my phrases, word for word, the ones I'd written in the project proposal years ago. Then the screen flickered, and a clip began to play. It was my scene. The women in the studio, repairing photographs. The same soft lighting I'd chosen. The same dialogue, the same pacing. My voice filled the hall, but it wasn't mine. It was that same bright, youthful voice that had replaced me. The audience leaned forward, moved. I felt my pulse slow to something heavy and deliberate. When the clip ended, Mason turned back to the moderator and said, "That moment, I think, captures the soul of the project, how memory can be universal when told through the right voice." The right voice. I don't remember standing up. One moment I was seated. The next I was on my feet. Words already leaving my mouth. "You forgot something, Mason." The microphone picked it up. My voice, older, lower, unmistakably mine. The room turned toward me in waves, heads twisting one by one. I took a breath and stepped into the aisle. "That voice you played? It isn't yours. And memory doesn't belong to any production company." You could have heard a pin drop. Mason blinked, frozen mid-smile. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure of the script. "Eleanor," he started, his voice thin. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No," I said, walking closer to the stage. "The misunderstanding is yours. You thought my silence meant consent." The moderator shifted in his chair, clearly panicking. "Ma'am, perhaps we can continue this." But the audience was already murmuring. Students pulled out their phones. Someone whispered, "That's her, the woman from the film." Ugh, Mason tried to recover. "Eleanor, you know this project was a collaboration. The final version represents the collective." "The collective didn't replace my voice," I cut in. You did. He looked toward the lights as if they could rescue him. We needed a consistent tone. You agreed to. I agreed to honesty, I said, not to erasure. There it was. The word that had haunted me for months, finally spoken aloud. The moderator motioned to the tech team, but it was too late. The auditorium had turned into a courtroom. Every whisper was an accusation. Every camera lens was now aimed at him. I climbed the first step of the stage. Light hit my face. It was blinding, hot, the same light that had washed me out of the film. But now it felt different, like a doorway instead of a punishment. I looked straight at him. You built your reputation on stories of women reclaiming their memories, and yet you erased the woman who gave you hers. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The room had gone utterly still. I turned to the audience. When I started this project, I told my students that memory doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest. Somewhere along the way, that truth was edited out. Someone in the back began clapping. Then another, then half the room. Mason stood frozen, his hand still clutching the microphone. I didn't stay to watch his reaction. I stepped off the stage and walked down the aisle. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. Just from release, like a pressure valve finally opening. Outside, the night air was cold and clean. I could still hear the muffled applause inside, but it already sounded far away. I pulled the Polaroid from my bag, the self-portrait I'd taken weeks ago. The corners were bent from being handled too much. I held it under the streetlight. The image of my face stared back, steady, unbroken. A journalist followed me out. "Ms. Reeves," she called. "Can we talk? What happened in there?" I thought about giving her a statement, something tidy for the morning news. But instead, I just said, the film was about women reclaiming their stories. I simply reclaimed mine. She nodded, and I kept walking. That night, I slept for the first time in months. No nightmares, no emails, no echoes of someone else's voice in my head. Just quiet. When I woke the next morning, my inbox was full again, messages from former students, strangers, even a few reporters. One of them wrote, "You were magnificent last night. You looked like you stepped straight out of your own film." Maybe I had. Because under those bright, merciless lights, for the first time in years, I wasn't erased. I was visible. And maybe that was the whole point. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. At first, I thought it was messages from friends who'd seen the confrontation the night before. But when I opened my social feed, the truth hit me like a gust of cold air. The headlines came one after another. Elderly woman crashes film panel, claims false credit. Eleanor Reeves suffers from delusions of authorship, insiders say. Former consultant attempts to sabotage award-winning documentary. There were hundreds of comments, some mocking, some cruelly amused. A few people defended me, but their words drowned in the noise. By noon, my name was trending. By evening, I had become a cautionary tale. People love stories of betrayal, but only when they can decide who the villain is. I didn't post anything. I didn't call anyone. I simply started taking screenshots, every article, every tweet, every edited quote. I created folders, labeled by date and time. It wasn't revenge I was planning, it was preservation. If Mason's version of memory was a film, then mine would be an archive. By the second day, I received a call from a local journalist. Her voice was gentle but distant, the way people sound when they don't quite believe you. "Ms. Reeves, Mason says you'd agreed to waive credit for creative reasons. Do you have proof otherwise?" "Yes," I said, "in my drawer." But when I opened the folder where I'd kept my contract, it was gone. I knew I hadn't thrown it away. I never threw anything away. I searched every shelf, every box, until the studio floor was covered in papers, old receipts, drafts, invoices, but not the document I needed. I sat on the floor, dizzy from the smell of dust and glue. That's when my email pinged. A message with no subject line, from an address I didn't recognize. Inside, one line, "He changed the clause after you signed." Attached was a scanned PDF. It was my original contract, complete with Mason's signature. but the copy I'd been given was different. The final page, the one stating that all contributors retain credit for intellectual property, had been replaced in his version with a vague paragraph about collective ownership. Whoever sent it had highlighted the difference in yellow. At the bottom, a note. He made us print the new page the morning after you left the meeting. You didn't know. I stared at the name in the sender field. It was Claire, one of my former students who'd become Mason's assistant during production. She'd been quiet, always watching more than she spoke. Be careful, the message ended. They're trying to silence you. But you're not crazy. I read it 3 times. Then I printed it out and filed it with the screenshots. That night, I went out to buy groceries, just to clear my head. But at the checkout line, I noticed 2 people whispering, glancing at me. When I got home, someone had slipped a flyer under my door, an ad for Mason's next public screening. The tagline read, "Because stories belong to everyone. Everyone except the one who lived it." For the next few days, my phone kept ringing, unknown numbers, some silent, some laughing before hanging up. I stopped answering. I stopped checking email. The noise outside grew louder, but inside I let silence grow like armor. Instead of fighting back, I began organizing. Each night, I labeled folders. Day 1, articles. Day 2, social media posts. Day 3, threat messages. I printed everything and placed it in a binder. I knew from years of restoring old photographs that evidence ages fast if you don't preserve it right. The same is true for truth. The Polaroid of myself still hung above my desk. Under the lamplight, the crack across my face glimmered faintly. For months, I'd seen that fracture as damage. Now, it looked like a lightning bolt, a mark of survival. 2 days later, Claire came to see me. She looked nervous, standing in the doorway with her coat still on. "They're saying you broke confidentiality," she whispered. "They want to sue." "Let them," I said quietly. "But you know that contract wasn't the same one I signed." She nodded, her eyes glassy. "I know. I have copies of the edits he made on his laptop. But if they find out I talked to you..." I placed a hand over hers. "Then you'll say you were doing what we always did, preserving the truth before it disappears." She hesitated, then opened her bag and handed me a flash drive. This is everything I could get. Emails, draft contracts, meeting notes. It's not enough to win a case, but it's enough to start one. I wanted to hug her, but instead I said, "You did the right thing." After she left, I sat in the dark for a long time, the flash drive warm in my palm. Outside, the streetlights flickered. In their reflection on the window, I could see myself, older, tired, but sharper somehow. I realized that every insult, every rumor, every piece of digital noise Mason had thrown at me had done the opposite of what he intended. It had forced me to remember who I was. He wanted silence. I was building an echo. The next morning, I backed up everything twice, 1 copy on a hard drive, 1 printed. Then, I began drafting letters to journalists, to legal advisors, to a friend who still worked in broadcast media. Not accusations, just questions, data, proof. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't post a single word online. But Mason must have felt the shift, because that afternoon, I received another message from him. "Eleanor, please stop contacting people. You're making this worse for yourself." I smiled as I read it. It was the first time his tone had cracked. That was the moment I knew the storm was finally turning. The smear campaign wasn't the end of my story, it was the middle of his. And I was no longer afraid of being forgotten, because the louder he tried to drown me out, the clearer my own voice became. I waited until midnight to open the flash drive Claire had given me. The house was dark except for the weak lamp on my desk. Outside, rain streaked across the window like film scratches, imperfections that time refused to edit out. I plugged the USB in, half afraid of what I might find. Inside were folders labeled with Mason's initials, dated from the earliest days of the production. Draft cuts, voice tests, legal notes. Everything looked harmless at first glance. Then I opened one folder called Archive TMP. There were several raw video files, each marked unused footage. One of them carried a name that stopped me. Lenore, mother scene, move. My throat tightened. I double-clicked. The screen flickered to life, and there I was sitting in my old studio talking about the photograph of my mother. She had been 19 when the war ended, newly married, smiling in her wedding portrait beside a man she barely knew. That photo had been damaged long ago, her face torn away during an air raid, the right half burned by candle wax. I had spent months restoring it, filling in the missing side pixel by pixel, like reconstructing memory itself. In the video, I was explaining to Mason why that restoration mattered. When you repair a photo, I said, you're not changing the past, you're giving it another chance to be seen. I remembered the day we filmed it. I'd cried halfway through and asked him to stop rolling. He hadn't. He'd said, keep going, this is real. But now, watching the raw footage, I saw something else. His reflection in the studio window, arms folded, watching me without expression. The clip cut off abruptly. I checked the timestamp. 2 minutes missing from the end. I searched the other folders and found the edited version used in the final cut. The scene was gone entirely. No mention of my mother, no trace of that story. In its place, Mason had inserted a montage of nameless women smiling under warm light, the younger narrator's voice saying, "Some memories are better left untold." I felt the air drain from the room. They hadn't just erased me, no. They had erased her. My mother had already survived being cut out of one photograph in her lifetime. When her husband remarried, he'd literally snipped her from their wedding portrait. For decades, that absence was all I had left of her. And now, decades later, Mason had done the same thing, with better equipment. I pressed pause on the video and stared at the frozen frame. My hands mid-gesture, the light catching on the silver bracelet she'd given me. The irony was unbearable. The project, meant to preserve women's stories, had become another weapon to silence them. I scrolled through the footage again, finding fragments I'd forgotten. Students crying during interviews, laughter between takes, small moments of real connection. All of them labeled CUT. It was like walking through a graveyard of truths that had never been allowed to live. Then I opened one last folder. Voice swap. Tests. Inside were multiple audio tracks of my interviews, my words spoken by different synthetic voices, each younger, clearer, more commercial. The metadata confirmed it. AI. Voice model. Approved by M.L. I leaned back, the realization settling like cold water. He hadn't just muted me. He had re-recorded me, fabricated a cleaner version of my own memory. I sat there for a long time, hands clasped, staring at the monitor. The rain outside had stopped, and moonlight crept across the desk, pale and fragile. It glinted off the old Polaroid still pinned to the wall. My cracked face split down the center. For years I believed light was truth, that the camera could never lie. Now I understood how easily it could be used to rewrite reality. I whispered to no one, "You took her out again, didn't you?" My mother's face, my story, my voice, all replaced by something smoother, safer, easier to sell. But here, in the flicker of this hidden footage, she existed again. I copied the files to 2 hard drives, labeled them by hand, and placed one in a metal box under the floorboards. The other I uploaded to a private cloud account under a pseudonym. If he tried to erase me again, this time the evidence would outlive both of us. I turned off the screen, letting the room fall back into darkness. For a moment, the afterglow from the monitor lit up the Polaroid's crack one last time. A white streak that looked almost like lightning. No one has the right to edit the truth of another person. Not even with light. After I discovered what Mason had done, the anger didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves. Quiet, methodical, almost polite. I didn't shout. I didn't post online. I simply opened a new notebook, wrote the title, out of frame across the first page, and underlined it twice. That night, I started making calls. Most production companies didn't answer. The few who did offered sympathy but no help. One executive said, "It's a touching story, Eleanor, but the right situation sounds messy." Then, a week later, a message appeared in my inbox from a small independent station in Oregon. We heard what happened. If you really have the footage, we'll air it, no charge. We believe stories belong to the people who live them. Oh, that was all I needed. I packed up the hard drives, my old laptop, and the Polaroid camera. The next morning, I boarded a bus north. The trip took 14 hours. Outside the window, the landscape blurred into a moving reel. Forests, rivers, snow-patched hills. It looked like the kind of film no one could edit. When I arrived, the station was nothing like the sleek studios I remembered. 2 rooms, a leaky roof, equipment older than my students. But the moment I walked in, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Trust. A young producer named Lila met me at the door. "We don't have much," she said, "but we have airwaves. If you can tell your story honestly, that's enough." I smiled. Honesty is all I have left. For the next 3 months, I worked alone. I lived in a small rented room above a bakery. Every morning, the smell of bread woke me at 5. By 6, I was in the editing bay, headphones on, sorting through hours of raw material footage I'd shot years before. The pieces Mason had ignored, the laughter between takes, the unguarded pauses. Some days, I couldn't bear to hear my own voice. Other days, it was the only thing that kept me going. I wrote the narration by hand, on paper first, because I didn't want a screen to tempt me to erase anything. The sentences came slowly, crooked, uneven, but they were mine. "We are all edited by someone," I recorded one night, my voice rasping through the cheap microphone. "But there comes a time when you must take back the reel." I recorded in one take. No cuts, no filters. When I stumbled over a word, I left it. Like perfection felt like proof. The title sequence appeared last. I filmed it using the old Polaroid camera, setting it to capture a series of still frames as light moved across the studio wall. Each photo developed at its own pace, the images bleeding into one another. The final shot faded into the words, "Out of frame." A film by Eleanor Reeves. When I saw it on the monitor, I laughed out loud. It was clumsy, unpolished, but alive. By the end of the 3rd month, I had built something small but solid. 42 minutes of truth stitched together by one tired woman and a camera that refused to die. Lila watched the first cut with me. When the screen went black, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she whispered, "It feels like watching someone learn how to breathe." We scheduled the broadcast for a Friday evening in late spring. The station didn't expect many viewers, maybe a few hundred. I didn't care. All I wanted was for the story to exist somewhere beyond me. The night before the premiere, I stayed in the studio long after everyone else had gone home. I adjusted the sound levels, checked the color grading, then turned off the monitor and sat in the dark. The Polaroid photo of my mother rested beside the keyboard. In the dim light, the repaired side of her face glowed faintly, almost smiling. "We made it back into the frame," I whispered. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the soft hum of the machines. There was no fear left, only a strange calm like the quiet before dawn. 3 months ago, Mason had tried to convince me that memory belonged to contracts and screens. Tomorrow, I would prove that memory belonged to whoever had the courage to keep it alive. I closed my notebook, switched off the lights, and left the studio. Outside, Oregon's night sky was clear. Millions of tiny lights, unedited, unowned. The theater was small enough that I could hear the ticket taker humming through the lobby wall. 40 seats, uneven floor, a projector that coughed each time the reel spun up. No celebrities, no red carpet. Just folding chairs and a chalkboard in the hallway that said, "Tonight, out of frame, 7:30 p.m. Lila stood beside me as people filed in: students, 2 elderly couples, a group of women from the community center, a local reporter with a notepad tucked under her arm. Claire slipped into the last row, cap low, collar up. When our eyes met, she gave the smallest nod. I nodded back. We'd decided not to advertise beyond a single post on the station's page. It felt right. I wasn't trying to win the internet. I just wanted the story to exist where someone could sit with it, without hashtags, without replies, without a storm. At 7:06, the lights faded. The room quieted into that tender silence I used to feel in the dark room. A hush that means something is about to appear. The first image landed on the screen the way a memory does. Not loud, not perfect. True. Hands sliding a torn photograph onto glass. Tape. A breath. A tremor. My voice, unpolished, unhidden, carried the first line I'd written on paper months ago. We take pictures to prove we were here. Sometimes we restore them to prove we still are. No one moved. The projector's hum took on a steady rhythm. I could tell when the audience leaned in by the creak of the old seats. Small sounds felt loud in that room. The rustle of a coat sleeve, a restrained sniffle, the soft clack of a pen as the reporter uncapped it. Halfway through, there was a brief glitch in the audio, my own fault, where a sentence doubled back on itself before settling. I left it there on purpose. The room held it with me. The way you hold a stutter in conversation and wait for the person you love to find their breath again. Then my mother appeared. The Polaroid came in slowly, a white square blooming into a face that time had once tried to erase. The repaired side wasn't perfect, it never would be. But in that imperfection I recognized her more clearly than I ever had. She looked 19 forever, and exactly the age she would have been now, all at once. The entire room inhaled at the same time. Not a gasp. A shared breath. It sounded like the sea right before a wave breaks. And then no sound at all, I narrated softly. My mother was cut from her wedding portrait because someone believed the new story was cleaner without her. Decades later, the world learned to do this with software, not scissors. But the act is the same. Erasure just looks prettier under better light. Someone near the front covered her mouth. The reporter's pen stopped moving. A man in the second row leaned forward and wiped his glasses on his shirt without looking away from the screen. The film moved on. The women at reframe telling their own truths in their own cadence, the laughter between takes, the stillness after tears. There was a shot of my cracked self-portrait taped to the wall, the fissure down my face catching the morning sun. I explained why I kept it visible. A crack is a line that refused to lie about pressure. Some truths survive because they never learned how to hide. Near the end, I spliced in a short, unflinching section from the flash drive. A title card explaining that the footage had been excised from the other film, then 23 seconds of my original interview about my mother, the very seconds that had never been allowed to live. I didn't add commentary or music. I wanted the room to feel the cut that had been made. The silence after it landed, heavier than any score could have managed. The final scene was simple. Me, in the studio, switching off the work light. The camera stayed on the empty chair for 5 seconds too long enough to make people slightly uncomfortable before it faded to black. The title returned in stubborn white. Out of Frame. A film by Eleanor Reeves. When the lights came up, no one clapped at first. Not because they didn't want to, but because it felt like applause would break something delicate we had all agreed to hold. And then, softly at the back, someone started. 2 hands, unhurried. Others joined. A small, honest sound that didn't try to be more than it was. I let it reach me. For once, I didn't duck my head. I stood there and took it in like oxygen. The reporter approached with her notebook shut, which told me she had stopped writing long enough to watch. "Ms. Reeves," she said quietly, "do you have anything you want to say to the people who cut you out of your own story?" I looked at the screen blank now, a white square waiting for whatever comes next. I thought of the panel, of the headlines, of the emails that called me delusional. I thought of every woman who had ever been told that her truth would be easier to hold if a fresher voice carried it. "They only erased me on screen," I said. "Outside of it, I'm still projecting." A few people murmured yes under their breath. The sentence wasn't a line I'd rehearsed. It arrived the way certain truths do, fully formed, the way your body knows a home it's never lived in. We opened the floor for questions. They weren't the kind that require a defense. They were human questions. How did you learn to fix photos without fixing the past? What do we do when the people with the lights don't want the truth in the frame? Where do we keep proof on paper? In the body? I answered the only way I know plainly. To store what you can, label what you can't. Keep copies in places machines can't quietly change. And don't wait for a microphone to make you real? Afterward, people took turns at the small card table in the lobby, scribbling their names on a sign-up sheet, asking for additional screenings at community centers and libraries. Claire slipped me a folded note as she left. There are others. I'll bring them next week. Her eyes were wet, but steady. Lila hugged me. We had 40 viewers in the theater, she said, and the stream, well, we didn't advertise it, but it's already in the hundreds. Someone mirrored it to a forum for archivists. She showed me a screen filled with comments that were mostly just 2 words. Thank you. By the time I got home, my inbox had changed shape. The earlier messages called me names. These asked for permission. A university wanted to show the film in a class on ethics. A small museum asked if they could borrow the Polaroid for an exhibit on repair as resistance. A lawyer who had once taken my portrait sent a 1-line email. If you want to talk, I'll listen first. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the cup between my palms, letting the heat soak into my fingers. The studio was dark except for the square of streetlight on the floor. I set my mother's Polaroid in that light and watched the paper whiten around her face as if the night itself were choosing what to reveal. My phone buzzed once more. A blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Whoever it was didn't leave a message. I thought of Mason, of the certainty he wore like cologne, of the way he asked the audience to trust him because the images were beautiful. I didn't hate him. I had learned something important about hate. It is a reel that loops the same scene until you forget the point. Well, it was not him. The point was that the women I had met in my studio, and the girl my mother had once been, and the older woman I had become, all existed at once on a screen that didn't belong to anyone else. I went back to the theater 2 days later for a second showing. Fewer seats were empty this time. 8 celebrities. A man I didn't recognize handed me a wrinkled photograph at the door. His sister, he said, lost to time and a basement flood. He asked if there was anything to be done. I told him to leave it, that I would try. He thanked me as if I'd already succeeded. During the Q&A, a student raised her hand and said, "You left the stumbles in your narration. Was that intentional?" "Yes," I said. I wanted my breath in the room. She nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. Maybe she did. Later, as people drifted out into the evening, the reporter from opening night returned. She looked different, less cautious, more sure. "Your line," she said, about being erased on screen but still projecting outside of it. We put it in the piece. It's traveling. She smiled at the oddness of the word. Traveling felt right. It implied motion without ownership. I walked home slowly, taking the long route. I passed shop windows catching the last light, dogs tugging their owners toward dinner, a teenager roller skating alone under a street lamp like a figure on an old film strip. At my corner, the bakery's sign flickered twice and stayed on. The world, against the odds, worked. Back in the studio, I took the cracked self-portrait off the wall. The tape left a small scar on the paint. I held the photo under my desk lamp and, for the first time, didn't see damage. I saw a map. Every line, a road that had carried me here. I set the picture down beside the camera and opened my notebook to a clean page. My hand didn't tremble. I wrote the words slowly, not as a statement but as a record. I used to be erased from the frame. Now my story is projected on the big screen, with light I chose myself. I closed the notebook and turned the lamp off. The room settled. Darkness. Then the soft shape of the window. Then the ordinary hum of a building where no one was applauding and nothing needed to be proven. I stood there a while longer, letting my eyes adjust. In the black square of the glass, my reflection steadied, uncredited to anyone but me. Mason went silent. No interviews, no statements, no defiance. Just silence. The kind that settles over a place after a storm has passed and you realize the air is clearer because something has been torn away. Within a week, his film disappeared from the streaming platform. The official reason listed was copyright dispute, but people understood what it meant. A few magazines tried to reach me for comment. I declined them all. I'd already said what I needed to say on screen. The truth didn't need more words. I wasn't happy about what happened to him. That's the part most people don't believe. They expect revenge to feel satisfying, like closing a wound with a flourish. But it doesn't. Revenge is still noise. I'd had enough of noise. Instead, I printed. I reopened the old studio, not the same reframe, but something smaller. Sunlight spilled across the cracked tile floors in the mornings. I bought a new printer, the kind that hummed softly, almost like breathing. The first image I printed wasn't new footage or a student's portrait. It was the old Polaroid, the one of my face, cracked straight down the center. I scanned it carefully, adjusted the levels until the split disappeared, and hit print. Ooh. The machine whirred. The paper slid out warm. For a moment, I just watched the colors bloom into being. The skin tone, the edges of my hair, the shadow in the corner of my mouth. When it finished, the photo looked whole again. No fracture, no scar. I pinned it to the wall of the new workshop, right above my desk. When I stepped back, I realized something simple. I hadn't erased the crack. I'd learned how to live beyond it. The new image wasn't cleaner. It was layered. If you looked closely, you could still see the faint ghost of the old line underneath, like a quiet truth that refused to vanish. The women from my classes started visiting again. Some brought coffee, others brought boxes of old photos wrapped in newspaper. They spoke softly at first, as if afraid the world might still be listening. Then, little by little, their voices returned to normal. One of them, an older woman named Ruth, looked at the photo on the wall and said, "You fixed it." I smiled. Not exactly. I just stopped pretending it was broken. Outside, Oregon's spring was already bleeding into summer. The air smelled of rain and sawdust. The studio windows stayed open all day, and sometimes strangers would wander in, thinking it was a gallery. I didn't correct them. I just let them walk around, looking. On the far wall hung the restored wedding portrait of my mother, the one Mason had deleted from his film. The repaired side of her face glowed softly under the afternoon light. People often paused there the longest. Some asked about the story behind it. Others didn't need to. They recognized the feeling. A journalist from a small paper finally convinced me to talk. Not about Mason, but about restoration. She asked, "Do you think light can ever lie?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering. "Light doesn't lie," I said. "People do. Light only shows what we're brave enough to point it at." When the interview was published, it wasn't sensational. A quiet piece titled, "Eleanor Reeves Teaches Us How to Stay in the Frame." One evening, I stayed late after class. The women had gone home, the city outside had gone blue with dusk. I sat at the table and turned off the main lights, leaving only the desk lamp on. The repaired Polaroid caught the glow perfectly. Its surface smooth, colors calm, no more shadows bleeding through. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to protect every frame of truth, and how, in the end, all it took to reclaim it was a refusal to look away. I poured myself a small glass of wine. Not a toast, not a celebration, just a ritual of staying. The email notification light blinked once on my laptop. Yeah, another reporter probably. Another question about Mason. I ignored it. Some stories don't need retelling, they need rest. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the windows like waves of white. The light washed over my face, then moved on. For the first time, it didn't feel like exposure. Felt like acknowledgement. I sat there until the night settled fully, letting the quiet stretch. When I finally stood, I looked at the photo again, my own face reflected faintly in the glass frame. The woman in the picture didn't look victorious. She looked real. And that was enough. A year later, I moved to Oregon for good. The air here smells like wet cedar and new beginnings. Sharp, clean, and slightly sweet after it rains. I rented a small studio on the edge of town and hung a wooden sign over the door. Heart restoration. It wasn't a photography studio anymore. I didn't teach people how to hold a camera or how to adjust exposure. I taught them how to face what they'd spent years cropping out of their lives. The moments too blurry, too painful, too unflattering to frame. Every woman who came through that door carried a different kind of silence. a widow, a single mother, a survivor, a daughter. I recognized them all because, in some way, I'd been all of them. We didn't talk much about art. We talked about witnessing. I taught them to record stories on whatever they had. Old phones, disposable cameras, even audio diaries. We called it restoring the frame, not reclaiming it. The old Polaroid camera, the one that had followed me through decades of love, loss, and betrayal, no longer worked. The shutter had given up long ago, but I couldn't throw it away. So I turned it into a lamp. A local craftsman helped me hollow out the body, thread a wire through the lens, and mount a small warm bulb inside. When I switched it on for the first time, light poured from the very place where pictures used to emerge. I hung it above the classroom door so that every woman who walked in would pass through its glow. Some of them cried when they saw it. They thought it was beautiful. For me, it was more than decoration. It was proof that something once used to capture could also be used to illuminate. The first class was small, 6 women and 1 teenage girl. We sat in a circle, not a row. Everyone brought one photo they couldn't look at anymore. One woman laid down a wedding picture. Another brought an image of a hospital bed. The teenage girl brought nothing but her phone, screen cracked, filled with half-deleted selfies. I told them, "You don't have to fix the photo. You just have to face it." We spent the whole afternoon just looking, not editing, not filtering, not judging. By the end, the room felt lighter, as if every image had finally been allowed to breathe. I saw it happen again and again, a quiet thawing. The moment someone realized the picture that once hurt could still hold warmth if you stopped trying to perfect it. One morning, a student named Maria pointed to the lamp and asked, "Ms. Reeves, do you still take photographs?" I smiled. "No, I let other people photograph themselves now." She laughed. "Then what do you do?" I thought for a second. "I hold the light steady." That answer surprised even me, but it was true. I had spent most of my life chasing the right exposure. For other people, for stories, for men who believed they could define what was worth remembering. Now I just offered light, and let others decide what to do with it. The Polaroid lamp hummed quietly above us, its glow soft, forgiving. Sometimes journalists still write about the documentary scandal, though the headlines have changed. Mason never spoke publicly again. His new projects faded quietly. I don't read the articles anymore. My story isn't about him. It never was. A few of my students asked if I felt vindicated. I told them no. Vindication is loud. Healing is quieter. In the second year of the workshop, we started a project called the Mirror Wall. Each woman placed one restored image beside a small mirror. It was simple. Before you hang the photo, look at yourself for 10 seconds. Not to fix anything, just to notice. Some mirrors stayed blank for weeks. Others filled up fast. By summer, the wall shimmered with faces and reflections, mothers, daughters, scars, laughter, wrinkles, new haircuts. None of them perfect, all of them real. It reminded me of my old exhibition, The Hands We Held, except this time the subjects were holding the cameras. One day, a familiar envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a letter from Claire. "I left the industry," she wrote. "I'm teaching now. I tell my students that footage is sacred, even the mistakes. Especially the mistakes. Thank you for showing me what honesty sounds like." At the bottom was a small Polaroid photo of her new class. 10 young filmmakers, their faces bright with that early kind of belief. Across the bottom margin, she'd written, "We're still projecting." I pinned it beside my mother's portrait. The 2 photos, one black and white, one full of color, faced each other like a conversation across time. That night, I stayed late in the studio, grading student journals. Outside, the rain returned, tapping against the windows. When the power flickered once, the Polaroid lamp stayed on, glowing through the dark. I walked over and switched it off myself, leaving only the faint after-image of its light floating in the room. In the reflection of the window, I saw my own outline. Older now, softer around the edges, but unmistakably present. I remembered something I'd said years ago, back when all of this began. Memory doesn't need to be perfect. It just has to be honest. for the first time, I understood what I meant. Because honesty isn't about confession or proof. It's about showing up, again and again, even after someone else has rewritten you. I closed my notebook, locked the door, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Down the street, someone was laughing. The world went on. So did I. And somewhere behind me, through the studio window, the little Polaroid lamp kept shining. A pulse of light in the dark, steady, uncredited. Mine. The camera was small, the same kind we used for class projects, propped on a tripod at the back of the room. The students had insisted I record a final message for the archive, though I suspected they just wanted proof that I was still here, still teaching, still shining the light. When the red dot blinked on, I didn't look away this time. I looked straight into the lens. The studio was quiet. Afternoon sunlight poured through the high windows, spreading across the floor like an old film reel. Dust floated through the air, tiny pieces of the world suspended in light. I took a breath. If one day you find yourself erased from the frame, I said, don't wait for someone else to photograph you again. Pick up the camera. My voice didn't shake. It wasn't bitter. Just steady. The kind of steadiness that comes after you've been broken open enough times to know you'll survive. I leaned a little closer. We spend so much of our lives waiting to be seen. Waiting for the right moment, the right angle, the right witness. But sometimes, the only person who can bring you back into focus is you. The room stayed silent. I could hear the hum of the old Polaroid lamp above me, soft and constant. Share this story, I said finally. Share it so someone else will know. Even when you've been erased, you still have light to shine. The red recording light kept blinking. I didn't stop it yet. I wanted a few extra seconds. The kind the editors usually cut out. The part where you exhale and let your face return to its real shape. The in-between. Because that's what life really is. Not the perfect frame, but the moment right after it. I smiled, small and real. My story ends here, I said. But maybe this is the first frame of your freedom. I reached forward and pressed the button. The light went out. For a second, the room went dark. Then, the Polaroid lamp flickered back on. One quiet pulse of gold in the stillness. Outside, a car passed, the reflection of its headlights sliding across the windows like film rolling again. I sat there a while, letting the hum of the machines fade, letting the silence fill with meaning. When I finally stood, I looked at the lens one more time, not to check the focus, but to thank it. For all its flaws, it had given me one thing that nothing else ever could. A way to turn light into proof. And if light can remember me, maybe that's enough. The next morning, I uploaded the video to the class website with a short caption. For anyone who's ever been cut out of their own picture, this is for you. By evening, it had spread far beyond the studio. Messages began to pour in from women I'd never met. Teachers, mothers, artists, survivors. Some sent photos of their own cracked images repaired with tape. Others wrote, I picked up my camera today. I read every message slowly, like letters from a world I had once thought I'd lost. And somewhere between the notifications, I realized something simple but immense. I was no longer trying to reclaim the frame. I had become it. My story closes here. But perhaps, just perhaps, this is the first frame of your freedom.